Namaskara and welcome to BIC Talks, a podcast by Bangalore International Centre.
Certainly, I think he would try to put on his mask, double masks, and go and find the stories on the ground. I think that's what made him so remarkable. He would sort of bring back our understanding of issues, political issues of where is the state through human stories. That would make more of an impact than anything I may say or you may write in your paper. So I think this is the ability and talent he had. I am sure there are many talented people sitting there. But the amazing thing that he had was the ability and capacity to think out of the box. Something that is in dire need in India today, to question things and not just assume that things that are as you are told they are. You have to ask, why is it that the state failed the extent to which it did? This is a debate that should remain. It will be a healthy debate. It's not criticism.
That was historian Professor Ayesha Jalal talking about how she thinks Manto would have responded to our current times. Saadat Hasan Manto was born on 11th May 1912 in Ludhiana. Bangalore International Centre and Bangalore Literature Festival marked the author and playwright's birth month through a BIC Streams session in late May 2021. The speakers were the Mary Richardson Professor of History at Tufts University, Professor Ayesha Jalal, and writer, columnist, and translator of Manto's non-fiction work, Aakar Patel. And now, over to Professor Jalal and Aakar.
Thank you very much. Thank you to all of you for joining. Thank you to Ayesha Jalal for joining us from the US. Thank you to BIC for doing this. And particularly thank you to the management at BIC for continuing to do this at a time such as we are going through. I'll speak very briefly about Manto in India. The myth is that he was more or less forgotten in the middle classes that did not read Urdu. In the 80s, there was a translation in Debonair of Boo, apparently by Khushwant Singh, which brought him back to a large extent in the Bombay circles. His play started to be performed again at Prithvi. And he came back to fame in Bombay, which was his city, of course. And that fame has remained. He is available to be read in most languages here. He goes into reprint quite a lot. The book that was referred to, which I translated a few years ago, has gone into a reprint as well. Almost his entire corpus is now there in Hindi, in the Nagari script. It's certainly there in Urdu, in 5 volumes. Some of it remains to be translated in English, and there are several projects working on it as we speak. He was always relevant because he was able to bring life and humanity to very large stories which had become numbers. And I think that it is particularly relevant that we should speak about him in our time. I'd like to start by asking Ayesha Jalal to tell us how she views the world of 2021, particularly looking into India and what is happening here. There are 2 threads that define the recent past that we have lived through. One is obviously the pandemic, which we are surviving and are going through over the last 13 months. The other is the nature of government and state in India and what has happened to it since 2014. Perhaps we can start with the first bit first, and Professor Jalal can speak to us about how she sees what is going on here.
Well, thank you for having me. And Aakar, I think there's no denying that what we are going through is our world-changing events. I think many of the follies of the earlier decades have been brought to the forefront, and what human decisions have been taken are being called into question or should be called into question in vigorous debate. The errors that were made in overvaluing certain philosophies and ideologies, for instance, the market at the expense of everything else, the deregulation of capital, but also its promotion in certain sectors. So I think the tragedy that's being enacted in the world as a whole does flow in large part from the philosophy of neoliberalism that willy-nilly was accepted by various countries with their own sort of adaptations, of course. So that said, I think in that context, you find that the health sector was sort of being privatized. I mean, a sector that traditionally had always been one in which the state was underperforming, undersubscribed, is the one in which the neoliberal philosophy conveniently left it to the market, to the private sector. So I think it was really something that some very wise people predicted was coming, and we were not prepared given the structures of delivery. So I think the lack of attention paid to the structures of delivery in the event of a pandemic that was well imagined by many experts is what I think needs to be discussed and debated. Why are we not prepared to do that? I mean, as a historian, and I mean, you as a writer would have no sort of surprise to know that it's human self-interest that led to this. But what can we learn from this? What can be the role of the state that is absolutely critical and cannot be debated away? So I think these are the sorts of issues that I think have come up across the board in different variations, of course, because their circumstances are so different. So I don't want to go on, but I hope I've answered some part of your question.
It seems to me that what you said, which is rational, simple, direct, does not still appear at the end of May 2021 to be the direction or the focus that we have taken. We don't have a larger debate on the nature of the state. We don't yet have a larger debate within politics also on what went wrong. We don't even have a consensus on the fact that something has gone wrong. The narrative seems to be that it's all well, it's just episodic, things will move on, things will get better. As somebody who has observed South Asia for decades, India also, why do you think this is? Why are we not able to look on ourselves with the kind of clarity that you just did a couple of minutes ago?
Well, I think part of the reason is the state has ostensibly adopted the philosophy of leaving things to the market. And I think that has led to a great deal of apathy that's been generated. But remind me of the earlier part of the question. And it's
that there seems to be a paradox in the fact that the state is saying to its population that it is in full control of the future of the nation and its people. But the fact that it's not able to deliver at a time like this is not being debated.
I mean, what I'm trying to say to you is that any expert sitting in India, a health expert, could have predicted that this is going to be a real challenge and we are not prepared, despite the fact that India has, many things going for it. I think that each country, and what we've been witnessing from the US, I mean, the US also struggled largely because you need a very vigorous interaction between the center and the states to really sort of combat a pandemic of this kind. And with the center, even here, refusing to sort of really participate in this debate because they didn't want to, as it were, get their hands dirtied. It led to chaos, and it took no time. I mean, America has turned around. The danger now is to remind the Americans that, you may have turned around in large part, but it's not gone. And the world is not okay, so you're not going to be okay. So I think that will be the challenge here.
A crisis like this, which goes on for the sort of length of time it has, results in a structural change in the way that governments function and the way that the state has a relationship with its citizen? Or do you think that this is just something that will pass and we will go back to where we were and back to our old failures and reliance on a system that has demonstrably failed?
I do think that this is not a one-off. I think that the degree to which countries across the world have been affected by this pandemic has to do with policies that were adopted. So it's not something that happened in the blue. Even if something happens out of the blue, a new novel virus, it happens within certain structural contexts. Your question is whether we'll need to restructure. I think the first thing that I want to ask is that whether we are even prepared to debate what needs to be restructured. I mean, we hear a lot about ethical leadership where I live. I keep sort of asking, what is ethics? What is ethical? Are we even agreed on ethical leadership? There are people in the world who think that authoritarianism is a damn good thing and strong leaders are a damn good thing. And we're seeing this in various countries. Others think that democracy is the answer. It's this lack of agreement that I think has led to a scenario where incumbent governments relying more on performative politics than governance, The focus has shifted from governance, in my view, to performance and also attack on the opposition. So long as the attack is on the opposition and you are performing all manner of things like an actor, I think it's possible to sort of just underplay governance. So I think that has happened to a large extent, which explains why. Partly to answer your question, there may be many other factors that need to be looked at as well.
To bring in the other strand that we were talking about earlier, we are going through a period since 2014 where what you just spoke about a performative governance, about a style which many of us feel is new to our country, which is hard and direct majoritarianism, where we've got laws for the first time in our history that have introduced religion into citizenship, that have criminalized various parts of specific communities' laws for the first time. How do you, as a historian of South Asia, see the period post-2014 as being different in any way, if you think it is different in some way? And where do you think we stand and where do you think we are going?
Well, I think that there's no doubt that there is something different. Right-wing majoritarianism of the kind that India is witnessing is sort of a departure from what was happening earlier. So we're witnessing some sort of a ostensible change, but it is overlaying some structural dynamics that have a longer history and will continue to have a longer history, and those relate to the different dynamics in the regions. How the overlay works is something that remains to be seen. Whether the BJP, if you like, magic or the Modi magic will work across the board, I think is now even more of a question than it may have been earlier. And I think that is basically what will determine if the BJP can win in the states where it has struggled in the past, such as the eastern states or the south. Then things may be, and holds on to UP and Bihar, then I think that it will be different. So I think the ability to I think your question seems to be, why are they able to do it when they are not actually performing? On governance?
Also, but I think that many of us who have been writing and observing, particularly in the news media, seem to believe that this is not structural. That what we are going through at the moment is merely a blip, and the normative period is a constitutional secularism, which we might return to at some point in the future.
I think it's a mistake. I think it's a lack of a historic understanding of the problem. It hasn't happened out of the blue. It's happened precisely because of the dynamics that happened earlier on. So I think so there I would say that something has happened. But India has a beautiful self-correcting mechanism, precisely what I'm talking about the overlay. An overlay where there is an attempt at a right-wing majoritarianism, which obviously, I think you'll agree is a construct as well. But that right-wing majoritarianism is undercut by regional dynamics that sometimes undercut that construct. It happened, as I showed with my own work on Muslims, that it didn't work. You can talk about Muslim stuff, but there are regional imperatives and class imperatives and ideological imperatives and God knows how many other. So I think life is more complicated, in my view. I think all these factors will be playing a role. So it won't be that simple, the narrative, as I think some people suggest. And I think the other thing that might explain the success of the BJP in convincing the people that they are the answer is the failure of the opposition parties. The Congress, of course, is a major sort of cause of the BJP's ability to do this, but also the regional parties. They haven't succeeded in any kind of serious federal front to oppose the BJP. So I think the Congress, of course, has lost the social basis of support, which have been to the BJP's advantage. This is really being done by the people of India. It's nothing, when you say, is it structural? It is structural because the Congress is no longer the entity it used to be. So electorally, there have been shifts. So those I would call structural. I don't want to get too bogged down in the niceties of language, but here I think what I mean by structure is that something quite basic has shifted.
How would you think Manto would react to the India of today? What would the focus be, particularly the Manto of his mature period, of the 40s, of the time when he goes through and writes, I think, some of his best work. How does he respond to trauma of the sort that we are going through today?
I think he would do a terrific job. Certainly, I think he would try to put on his mask, double masks, and go and find the stories on the ground. I think that's what made him so remarkable. He would sort of bring back our understanding of issues, political issues of where is the state through human stories. That would make more of an impact than anything I may say or you may write in your paper. So I think this is the ability and talent he had. I am sure there are many talented people sitting there. But the amazing thing that he had was the ability and capacity to think out of the box, something that is in dire need in India today, to question things and not just assume that things that are as you are told they are. You have to ask, why is it that the state failed the extent to which it did? This is a debate that should remain. It'll be a healthy debate. It's not criticism. The problem is the reduction of governmental processes to electoral debate. You need to pull out and talk about the longer trend. Pandemics are not a 5-year phenomena. They're going to happen over the long run. So you're going to need to change and learn from this pandemic what it is telling you. I think Manto would be quite happy sort of adding that sort of, in a way that might have, conveyed the point better than you and I have been able to. I mean, that's all I'm saying, Aakar. You have to ask me an abstract, speculative question. I assume he would do that.
You replied in exactly the fashion that I thought you would. I think that he has the capacity to be able to make something memorable. And it's difficult even for those of us who have studied the data on the 40s to know what the numbers were, what they meant. But it's easier to go back to him and his writing and be able to, in some way, immerse yourself in what that period was actually like. And I think we may have a lot of very fine writers and videographers. What is needed today, and I'm sure that it is happening to a large extent, is a Manto-esque capture of what is happening so that the stories don't die, that they live on.
One additional point, Aakar, that there's been a danger throughout this crisis and tragedy as it has unfolded over the last 14, 15 months that, people are getting neutralized to statistics. What Manto would have done would be to show the discrepancy between statistics and real life stories. I mean, I think we need to humanize statistics. We need to realize, and this younger people need to realize that this is it's the stories of this pandemic that are going to educate us of what we need to do we can't prevent such crises from happening, but we can be better prepared for this.
A local newspaper that I have to its masthead carries every morning a table on how many were infected yesterday, how many were tested, how many died. But beyond the point, on day 40 or day 400, which is what this is, those numbers don't make any sense anymore. I think that it is required for a nation to be able to fully absorb what it has gone through, that the stories be told, and they be told in a direct way of the sort that Manto was very good at doing. To me, I think that of all the volumes on my shelves on how partition is depicted, the only ones that I remember and that tell me what happened in Bombay in the 40s, how it was in Lahore just after August 1947, what happens to people who are not from Pakistan and need to travel from Lahore to Karachi and so on, comes to me from Manto. And I think on both sides of the border, the material that I have found most useful to understand what India went through in the 40s is to some extent the volumes and the text that the leaders and the historians have left behind. Sole Spokesman, obviously one of them. On the other hand, what brings this stuff to life and makes it real is material that could only be one paragraph. And towards the end of his life, as he began to tell us the story of partition and what came after it, he was able to, in a remarkable way, communicate an entire story full of characters, full of action in just a couple of dozen words, which is astonishing. I think that skill and that talent of his, which can only be communicated in writing. I suppose it could be done as a poetry and be read out. But very few writers have the ability to, in such limited space, be able to communicate something so whole. I think also that the modern media and the way that it has gone about covering this pandemic has suffered for two reasons. One is that we don't have the kind of independence that a normal democratic nation would have. Professor Jalal might or might not know that the Union Government of India is the largest advertiser in South Asia. It sends about $500 million directly and through a company that it owns to the media. And at a time, particularly like the one we are going through, where the media is hard pressed and the economy is under a pressure, storytelling tends to happen with a narrative that is sent down from the state. And the levels of independence that the media in this country may have had a couple of decades before no longer exists to a large extent. But there are several small media houses that survive on very little money, almost none of it coming from the government, which have a lot of storytellers who represent the kind of spirit that we saw in Manto, that they have the ability to go out by themselves into the street, capture the characters, show us what is going on. They have been discouraged, much like Manto no doubt was in his time. The photographer and the videographer who has gone to the funeral pyre, who has gone to the crematorium, has been told that what he's doing is unholy and is not a reportage. For this reason, I think it is all the more important that in our time we find people who have the ability to capture this crisis in the way that it should be.
The audience questions posed to the speakers will now be read out by Sri Krishna of Bangalore Literature Festival.
There's a question from Sumit Chatterjee who asks, what was Manto's take on religion and God? I'd say if both of you could respond, that would be great.
Well, I mean, I would say that his religion was not the religion of the die-hard ulama, orthodox ulama, whom he made fun of for the most part. It's interesting that his one sort of, I mean, he talks about religion, I mean, quite a bit, but he was by no means your kind of die-hard practicing Muslim. But he did make one concession, which was before starting an essay or a short story, he would begin with 786, which is Bismillah, the number. So he did make that concession. He obviously had a religious upbringing, but it wasn't a religion in your face kind of a scenario. And he certainly had some rather critical things to say about those who tried to become the guardians of religion. So, I mean, the self-appointed guardians of religion were always the ones who disliked what Manto had to say. So they were basically his detractors. So I would say that would explain the relationship between Manto and religion.
He has a very unusual, for a South Asian, ability to not keep looking at the other person's faith. So when we have a religious debate in our part of the world, the tendency is to say, but what about you? And why should you say it? And, what about your faith? There is nothing in his writing where he does that. There is nothing to suggest that he even felt that. His family, he died when his daughters were fairly young, but it's a very liberal family of the sort that you would find in any upper middle class part of the subcontinent, which might be linked to faith in some way personally, but has no prejudices that they show. It may interest people to know that the flat he was given in Lahore was part of a building where Manishankar Iyer was born, and it was called Lakshmi Mansion. I think that's the name of the place. It is not possible to translate his writing and be able to come to a conclusion that he was in any way dependent on faith for what he was writing. I think he was truly independent of mind. He came from a place where very few of us can come, and I think that prejudice and the bigotry were the last things that he had when he put his pen to paper.
Sorry, there's an interesting question, I think, on a bit of a lighter note, perhaps, from Mihir Mahajan, and I'll ask you to respond, Aakar. How would Manto react to the new media ways of telling stories? How would he utilize 1-minute TikTok videos? And what would his tweet threads look like?
He would be magnificent. I think that anybody who can deliver a story in 70 words, in 80 words, as he was able to do, and to capture both action, emotion, and the character in a paragraph would be devastatingly good. He would. Also, I think that not too many of us on the subcontinent have the ability to look at serious material and do that with humor. I think that he has. Why does he still live on, and why are we discussing him so many decades after he died? Because the material is still modern. That it is something that is not specific to his time. I'm not referring to the content. I'm referring to the style. And he would have been excellent at doing TikTok, at doing Twitter, and all the other things that require good storytelling in very concise forms.
Great. There's a question for Professor Jalal from Dharen Chadda. He asks, Manto did not return to India, unlike Sahir Ludhianvi or Bade Ghulam Ali Khan Sahab. Why do you think that was so?
It's very simple, family reasons. His wife didn't want to return. And so, I mean, he had 3 daughters. She had her sister, her mother, her brothers in the city. And so I think she just wanted to stay with her family. And Manto was not about to sort of leave his family behind and go to Bombay. I mean, not to say that relations between the 2 countries were hardly conducive or inviting for him to keep popping across and coming back. So I think all those factors played a role.
Just to add to that, we don't have enough material from this side of the border on how Muslims or how people who went back there were treated in the film industry. We know a lot about what they were like because of Manto's sketches of people who were famous in that time. But to what extent did they seek to bring him back? What were the efforts they made to ask him to come back? We don't know too much about that.
But I found quite a bit about it in the letters that I scrutinized while doing my book, The Pity of Partition, on Manto. I mean, there were those who were trying to suggest that he should come and get his royalties. There was a royalties issue that you couldn't pay money. There were those who, Ashok Kumar wrote to him saying that he missed him and that he should come, and he was amazed that he left without getting in touch. So there's some very emotional letters that were written to him asking him to return. But as far as I'm aware, in all the stories constructed about why he didn't return, I think it's quite simple that he didn't see much prospect, and his wife certainly wasn't movable.
Did he see his success in the newspaper writing field that he followed later in Pakistan and in Lahore as something that was satisfying? And
I think he was not satisfied in the least bit after moving to Pakistan. I mean, whatever he did, his staying on. I personally think that he wrote his best literature while in Pakistan. But I do think that he. It was really something that he writes himself that I'm not really, at times I'm told I'm a very important writer, and other times I'm told that I'm a useless person. So, the sense of not really being able to get his status established in Pakistan comes out as a theme in Manto's personal lament about Pakistan. You raised the issue about the film industry, about what really was going on. Of course, there was this basic constraint that the industry didn't take off. There wasn't much of a market. The industry that Pakistan was able to put together in the 50s, 60s was largely running because of East Pakistan. So I think it's important to realize that Pakistan has some sort of an industry, but it had a very, very lucrative industry in the 60s and early 70s. And that, of course, was affected after 71. The market is altered, and that changes things. But in the immediate aftermath of partition, the attempts by Noor Jahan and her husband, they all tried to do something, but it just didn't work because the market was not there. So so he was never satisfied. I don't think he was at all satisfied because he was doing well in the Bombay film industry. He left, but he never was able to find his ground in Pakistan again.
Why do you think that his writing outside of films is so much more popular than his film writing itself?
Well, because the film writing was based on a lot of compromises he had to make with those making the films. And he writes about it saying that they are questioning my language because they talk nonsense and they want that nonsense written in dialogue. And sometimes he would say, do it. But at other times he said he's just not going to do it. He'd walk away. So I think one has to realize that the film industry, one might even ask the question, why is it that to this day, other than Mirza Ghalib, why none of his scripts really were successful? Is that the fault of the scriptwriter? Because the stories themselves are very sort of compelling, but yet Manto has not made for a successful film. So I think that is another reason why his other work is so much more popular.
Which of Manto's stories do you feel best reflect what's happening in India during COVID and post 2014 in general? This is a question from Amal Rakeshi.
The COVID is unlike anything that one human memory can recall at one level. And partition comes to mind. It's the violence of partition and it's the human suffering. So I would say that what is similar and where the empathy would be there is the partition period, where it was just human misery and suffering that brought about by human action, and this one brought about by human action too, but ultimately in response to a pandemic that we know is caused by many other factors as well. So I do think that there are broad similarities between these two periods, and what is common, the common thread is, and that's what makes Manto, is his ability to point to the human dimension in such wonderful ways without really pointing the finger to anyone or seeming bigoted. And I think he'll be able to do this very well with the COVID story, not only at the very human level, but in terms of some principles and ideas. I think we were discussing this earlier, but I do think that, for instance, there's a lot of talk about the patents being made available to India so that India can quickly manufacture the vaccine. And I think that this is really crucial and it should be done. And the WHO has been saying this for ages. But it is only now that we see a change in Washington. And I think that's a good thing. So that's where I would go.
I would say yes, that the similarity is a large number of people going through similar trauma. So it's the same as we had in the 40s, or hundreds of thousands of families going through similar pain. Exactly the same thing that was going on in Punjab in many families, and in Bengal in many families, who would know what it was like to be in a neighborhood which was under stress, who would know what it would like to be desperate to try and find a buyer for their house, who would know what it would like to be going into a place that they've never gone to before to start a new life. Hundreds of thousands of people on both sides. Similarly, I think that what we went through in April and much of May was people who were bereft of the protection of the state for the most part, people who were left, who were in the middle class and could access the charity and the friendship of strangers on social media, might have got a bed or a cylinder, but for the most, this was not the case. And I think that Manto would have been very good at replicating exactly what he did with his stories on Partition, Koldo, Mistake, in this kind of period where he brings to life individual stories which are being multiplied and being lived by millions of people at the same time.
Another question from Indranil Mukherjee, and this is going back in time a little bit. Who were the authors Manto admired and or was influenced by, if at all?
I mean, that's easy. I mean, again, I've written about it. I mean, he was most influenced by Maupassant, but he was influenced by all the Russian greats as well, whom he read. And he did two things. I mean, he in his early years, before he became a short story writer or known as one, is that he produced an anthology, or rather translated Russian stories, which were, again, I mean, in English, from English to Urdu, and he did the same for French. So Maupassant, certainly he learned the art of story writing from Maupassant and many of the other Russian greats. There's no question about that.
So what I said earlier was a reflection of what Naipaul has written about Maupassant, that he had the capacity in very limited space with not too many words, very few paragraphs, be able to communicate a lot of things. I would say, though I'm not a critic, based on what I've read, Manto towards the end of his life is able to do that much better in much more limited space. And tell it.
He would love you, Aakar, for sure, for that.
And he does it. He is quite strange in a way that a lot of his material reads through in translation. When you read English translations of Desi stuff, normally it tends to sound odd in some way. It tends to sound off in some way. This is not true of him. Because his language is so precise and direct, it is very easy to be able to be communicated in several languages. The other thing is that though he was himself not very academically minded and he dropped out of college, as we know, the brightest minds of who were writing in that period, including on politics, sought to engage with him vigorously, whether negatively or not, including the Bombay set that was extremely well read, but thought of him as being serious enough and his material as being serious enough to be able to engage with, including people like Ali Sadat Jafri and all who have engaged with his material at depth. So I think that from what he came out of, what he built was quite magnificent, and I think he was able to, in many ways, not just be a copy of the people, of the writers that he tried to emulate, but build something entirely new and something that has lived on for a very long time.
Got it. Thank you. There's another question again, going back a little bit in time. Deepa asks, did Manto provide solutions to problems, or did he only highlight the issues that he faced or observed during the independence era?
I think he left it to the conscience of the people. I mean, he's not a problem solver in that sense, but he did show you life in all its complexity without taking sides. And I think one of the things that he did was to show that, I mean, the human beast is everywhere in all of us, and it could easily erupt, and we should be forewarned that circumstances bring it about. And so, whatever, so we should we realize that even in your moment of bestiality, I mean, that's Thanda Gosht, that there is still that humanity in a person. So I think that he's very profound in his simplicity, which I think is something that the younger writers should ponder over. I mean, he was, of course, reacting to a Persianate tradition of something that was very ornate language used, and of course that changed. But I think he seemed to have gone even further. I mean, I think he learned the plot techniques from Maupassant. And I mean, of course, he'll be delighted to hear that he's successful in some respects. But I think that there is a connection of people. I mean, Manto didn't just arrive from nowhere. I mean, he was in a context. He did read and he did learn. I mean, one of the first things he translated was and what was this? That Victor Hugo's, life in one day in the life of a sort of a person who's eventually sort of hung. So he did a lot of that, and I think that helped him learn the art of storytelling a lot. a lot more.
One of the things that we have a problem with in our part of the world is that we don't debate things enough. You can find a solution if you look at reality with an open and sort of honest mind. And you cannot arrive at the solutions when you deny yourself either part of the narrative or one half of it fully. And I think that what he did was to bring to the table the full extent of the problems as we saw them. And I think that is the first, and it is the most important step towards coming to whatever solution or solutions there might be. I think there was an honesty in his writing and a communication of a reality that to a large extent resolves whatever it is that the solution needs to be. Even today in 2021, we are in denial of the fact that we are going through a crisis. We believe what it is that the state is telling us in terms of what the condition is today and what it will be in the future. And I think that it is required that we be honest with ourselves as the first step and the most important step to finding a solution.
I think building on that, Atul Sood asks, those were times when Bolsheviks took root and it was the dominant thinking during Manto times. Would it be different now given the economic narrative has changed?
I'm sorry, I didn't quite get that question.
I guess
he asked whether the fact that the Bombay set and there's a communism could be something that we could go back to in these times.
Oh, I see. Oh, yes. I mean, well, I think some people certainly can and have, in the sense that, I mean, all the sort of problems that have emerged as a result of the pandemic are seen as accentuating or highlighting all the problems that were intrinsically there in a system that promoted the interests of capital, of private capital, for that matter, at the expense of the interests of the poor, the masses. So I do think that in that sense, there is a connection there.
No, I think the question was more around, back then was when all of this was when the Bolsheviks took root, and that was the dominant thinking during Manto times.
And so could left-wing thinking return? So yes, I mean, the point is that
given that the economic narrative has changed now, I think that's really where this is coming from.
Has it changed? To what extent has it changed? I mean, is welfare being promoted above growth? I'm not so sure about that yet. I do think that the fundamental premises of the economics discipline are under debate. Because, I mean, I think that this whole business of measuring the welfare of a country or people on the basis of quote unquote growth, as opposed to people, I think has been called into question. And I think, but it's not that it has automatically brought about any change for that matter. And I think this is the point that we were discussing earlier. The great danger and the great tragedy would be that if we persisted in our old ways without taking the time out to debate and learn from this experience so that we don't do it again. But my fear is that we might, and that might lead to a much worse situation. So I think this is really the primary question of what are the lessons we are taking away from this pandemic, and to make sure that while we know it'll happen again, but we'll make sure that we are not as much in doubt and the state responds more effectively, as do the people. Because I mean, this has been also a very frustrating experience for people who are part of the state, because people don't listen to the SOPs and observe them. So I do think it's really both ways. Things have to change, and some education is needed, I think, very seriously.
So Manto had a problem also with the progressives and the nature of the state in a communist nation. So he was, I think, the classic liberal who would be dissatisfied no matter what came to be. But it is definitely the case that whatever was being debated in the progressive communes in Bombay in the 30s and 40s has today come to be, that we have reached a position where a crisis has revealed in quite obvious fashion the fact that the state is not actually prepared for the worst possible problems that might hit communities across the country. And that there is, if this large a crisis doesn't produce thinking that leads to change on things like the size of the health budget, how it is that we should be protecting the poor in a period where you've got 90-day lockdowns, you've got 60-day lockdowns, I think it will reflect really poorly on us.
There's a couple of questions on Manto's writing. And again, while it's specifically addressed to you, Professor Jalal, I'd really love for both of you to answer. The first one is, Professor Jalal, I have a feeling that the translation of Manto's fiction has not necessarily been able to express the depth and intensity of his emotion and feelings. What's your opinion in this regard? And related to that, I think another question is, what would be your comment on the end of the story, on the ending of the story, Khalid Mia? And again,
I'm trying to remember. Khalid Mia is about his son, the death of his son, I think, Arif. But coming back to, so the earlier one is about, say that again?
The earlier one is really about saying the translations don't necessarily...
don't come up. Well, I mean, translations are never easy. And I agree with you. And I think I should put this on the record that the first ever translation of Manto into English was done by my father, Ayesha Jalal. And that was done under the scrutiny of Manto, rather that, I mean, Manto knew they'd already done, I mean, which were eventually published in 1956 as Black Milk, were done under his scrutiny. I mean, so he did supervise or rather read, and he thought they were okay. My father was not satisfied, but Manto thought they were okay. But I do think that, I mean, Khalid Hassan, who did a very noble job in bringing Manto to the attention of the world, leaves out entire passages that he doesn't understand or finds it difficult to translate. So, I mean, yes, I would agree that the translations have not done justice enough, but some have been better than others. And I believe that there will be others to come for you to judge. I mean, obviously, there's nothing like reading him in Urdu, which I do, but I mean, you can read him in Hindi because he is available in Hindi. So I think that he's best read in either Urdu or Hindi. So if you don't have Urdu, you read him in Hindi.
He's done so I think the non-fiction tends to be simpler to do for the translator than fiction. But I think that given the number of people who have and are doing translations of him, there is going to be some which are indifferent and some which are good. I think that for the most part, because of the quality of Manto himself, he's an easy author to translate. If you read him, and especially if you're Desi, it's not that difficult to communicate what it is that he's saying in simple English. There are some issues. So I think that one of the ones that I saw, I had a problem with was where the word ustra was communicated as razor blade, you know, where it doesn't represent quite the menace of a cutthroat blade. So, but that's really minor. I'm saying that for the most part, if you look at his text side to side with many of his translators, including Khushwant Singh, several others, people from India, from Pakistan have done a pretty good job.
There's another question from Prakhil Singh who asks, why do you think Saadat could not let go of Manto amidst all the tragedy that went on in his personal life in his last days?
Because he knew that Manto will live longer than Saadat, and he said it in so many words that, you know, ye bhi ho sakta hai ki Saadat mar jaye. The point is that Manto to nahi, I mean, he would much rather that Manto lives on even if Saadat dies. I think that's how he would respond to it.
I agree. I think that, yeah. And he has, I think he probably knew, and we might think that he was arrogant enough to believe it, but I think certainly he knew that what he was leaving behind was something special and something that would live long and something that would revive in all parts of the subcontinent. And he was absolutely right. He was a good judge of his own work, which it is difficult to be.
I think Ratan alludes to an earlier part of the conversation where he says, you mentioned after a point we've become numb to numbers. The number of needlessly dead doesn't really have an impact anymore unless, of course, the tragedy has happened very close to home. He goes on to say, this means that those guilty get away relatively without consequences. So his question is, in a fictional world of Manto, how would he ensure these major events didn't get forgotten? And is that possible for us to do?
I mean, do the guilty really get away? Because, I mean, the guilty also are humans. So I mean, I think the beauty of Manto is that he doesn't try to find, unmitigated evil in anyone. He doesn't see unmitigated evil. Evil is a social production. A human being can be good in certain circumstances and very, very bad and evil in others. So I think that's his philosophy. And so in that sense, he will show that even the most criminal-minded individual, or who seem to be the most criminal-minded individual, may have some goodness in them. So the challenge of human life is to sort of ensure that people's goodness is brought out rather than their evil behavior. I think that was Manto.
He doesn't, there is no sense of vengeance in the man. If you read the entire corpus, there might be anger at times, there might be irritation at times, including with leaders like Gandhi, but there is no sense of the kind of vindictiveness or vengeance that has come to dominate the narrative in our times in democratic spaces like India, where I think the idea of justice necessarily means a crucifixion of some sort. He was very distant from that sort of thing, and I think that is one of the many things that makes him very great.
Great. I think that's about what we have time for. Maybe I'll ask Professor Jalal and Aakar share a few thoughts in closing before we wrap up.
I just want to say that people have always said that partition made Manto the great writer that he is. I wonder whether there is such a thing as COVID making some future great writer.
Wow.
That's the thought I would leave behind in terms of what you had in mind for this panel. I think that is the thought that I have. Thank you.
I'd really like it if we were able to be over with this crisis soon and would have some sort of lessons to have absorbed from it. I suspect that, as has been the case with many of our crises in the past, that may not come to be. But it is also a fact that we have not gone through a phase in our history where a crisis has been with us for this long and has touched all of us. It is not common to have the middle class rely on, and by middle class I mean the wealthy, we are a very small number of people, rely on each other, come to a kind of a consensus that things are broken, and then try and fix it for all of us. We are at that stage now, and I'm really hoping that we have people, we have stories that are told that are as memorable as the ones that Manto told that make this possible.
Thank you, Professor Jalal. Thank you, Aakar, of course, for continuing to keep Manto relevant, and even more so in these times. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for hanging in there and listening to the full conversation. If you liked what you heard, do share it with friends and family. You can also leave us a review or rating on iTunes and Apple Podcasts. The crew behind this podcast is Gaurav Krishna on sound supervision and production, with support from S. Sarvanaraj and Raghu Tenkaila. Episode artwork and design is by Chandni Venkataraman. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel on your favorite podcast platform. It can also be accessed on our website, bangaloreinternationalcentre.org. This is Lekha Naidu, signing off on behalf of everyone at BIC.